What's up, designers? Welcome back to the studio. Today, in this tutorial, we're going to do a little bit of a wrap-up on this cut paper project by applying your designs to something that you own. Let's do a quick recap. We started this whole project off with some cut paper shapes, practiced our pen tooling, did a little bit more advanced shape building in Illustrator, actually applied some design principles, linear symmetry, radial symmetry, and pattern to those same exact designs. Well, today we're going to put some of this design work to task, and we'll use one of the objects that you just sort of happen to have with you. In my example, I just pulled one of my old work boots off, and I'm going to kind of dress up my work boot with a couple of different approaches to applying this design. Everything from overlays to sort of like image tracing and doing cutouts and masking it in to manipulating color. As long as you produce one of these attempts, we'll call that good. Let's start all the way back at the beginning though. After getting a good photograph of your subject, we'll talk through sort of ascending layers of difficulty here with the project. I'll say that maybe one of the most straightforward techniques would be to use an overlay. So this is the photographic image that has a design overlay sitting on top of it. Now what makes this overlay a little bit more complex than just sort of a standard stamp here is that I've carefully cut out the design along the edges of one of these boot panels, and I've also applied a little bit different coloring, a little bit different blending mode, so I can actually see some of the boot texture through the design. We'll talk through that one first, and then we'll move on to some more complicated sort of vectorized approaches that will make use of some of the patterns we have, and they really become more of a design and less of sort of like a photograph with the design pasted on top of it. So if we're going to do anything like a pasting, what we need is a photograph that has a nice clean background, fairly decent lighting, and I'm going to lock out this layer so it doesn't move around on me. I'm going to paste any of the designs that I want to use then into a second layer sitting on top. Let's work with the same design here, this spiral. I'll come up to my radial symmetry design, grab this one, Command C. I'll jump back into this image, Command V, paste. Okay, nice and dark, nice and black, so I could, right, just sort of stick this on top of the photograph and call it a day, but it really doesn't quite feel like it's becoming part of the image yet. A couple things are going on. It doesn't really fit to the edges of the photograph, it doesn't really fit to the edges of the boot, and the colors don't really match. Let's deal maybe with the colors first. If I want to match this design to the sort of space, the color space of the boot, and really kind of sell the idea that it, is printed onto the boot itself and not just pasted in digitally, I can come up to my control bar up here where it says opacity. If you don't have a control bar turned on, click Control, Window, Control, and where it says opacity, we can do simplistic things like ducking the opacity, and that will sort of blend it in a little bit. In this case, because it's solid black, the color black, it's not really working, right? Ducking the opacity just kind of grays it out. I do see the boot underneath, but it's really faint. In this case, I'm going to go to opacity, and clicking on opacity allows me to not only manipulate the percentage, but also manipulate what are called the blending modes. These different blending modes will sort of give me different versions of blending that design into the sort of boot photograph. Multiply, overlay, maybe a soft light. These are sort of approaches to sort of laying design in that allows some of the boot texture to sort of pull through the design, and it really makes it feel much more like it already exists in the image. Things like this highlight sort of travels through, and the design actually starts to feel like it's moving with the boot. That's not bad. This one was a solid black design, and I gave it a soft light opacity. That's actually a little better even than what I had in my original over here. This one is a ducked opacity with an overlay setting, and it's actually the color white. It really kind of depends on the color space of your design and the and sort of the way that it fits into your object. Now, if you notice on this design, I've really carefully sort of cut the edges of each one of my shapes so that it starts to fit inside the edges of the shoe. Now, you could do this a couple of different ways. One of the ways that I sort of like is to pre-trace the paneling of the boot so that I already had this sort of upper piece of leather cut out. I'll talk about that next, but it is possible to just carefully cut these edges off. Say I wanted to manipulate the shapes here or bend them around. I can kind of manipulate these shapes anchor point by anchor point, and that would work too. You'll see that I even kind of cut out around some of the boot eyelets just to sort of, it looked a little funny to have the design on top of the lacing eyelets. So what about actually tracing the panels so that I could actually sort of make this fit or use a panel cut? Well, for that, we're going to have to come back to our pen tool tracing technique. In this technique, I have the boot image turned down to a lower opacity, have that layer locked, and then I've come in with the pen tool. Pen tool tracing out the boot is going to be almost exactly like pen tool tracing out the cut paper from previous assignments. It's just that this time I am going to be sort of working with following the panels of the boot leather fabrication, and not the sort of edges of the paper. I'm going to do just sort of a quick tracing of this panel here, and then maybe go in and fine-tune some of these handles a little bit. I'm not going to trace the entire boot for this demonstration, but you get a sense of maybe how this would work. In this case, I have an upper traced out and then the heel cup traced out. It might make sense just to have these individual pieces, or it might make sense to actually trace the whole silhouette or some combination. You'll see in my examples here that I started tracing out each one of these individual pieces because I found that it was useful when I was designing some of these bottom boots here. Some of these bottom designs not only have a little bit of image tracing, which we'll get to, but they have designs that have been carefully cut out to fit into those panels, and I can also work with color, right? Each one of these pieces can be pulled out, and it sort of fits together like a puzzle. How might I use that? Well, let's start with maybe the design first. I think that's maybe the most basic one to work with. So if I wanted to work with sort of this part of the toe cap, I might make a copy of that and bring it over to a photograph that I'm working with, say this one right here. And because the photographs are scaled to the same size, this allows me to sort of fit it right into position. Now, if I wanted to take a design and custom fit it into that space, this is that other technique, right? Of instead of manipulating each one of these anchor points, I could grab a hold of a texture, kind of like this texture here that I built, Command C, Command V paste, and I'm going to use this as sort of a stencil cutout. I'm going to put this design right on top. I'll shrink my texture down a little bit so that the details are kind of held up. And when I select both of these designs, I can navigate to my Pathfinder tool, and down here in the lower left-hand corner, divide will sort of separate out each one of these designs along this line that I have cut. Right-click, ungroup it, and this is a bit of kind of painful work here, but I need to delete away some of this extra stuff around the edges, and you'll sort of see how it goes. It has removed those pieces of the design right along the edges of that toe cap tracing. Now there's some sort of funky line work that's cutting around the edges here. I'm not going to get too concerned about that, but I sort of like the way this design is working. I'm going to grab all these designs again, do a Command G group, and then that piece would sort of sit and fill right into that kind of paneling on the boot that I've got there. That's another way, instead of manipulating each individual anchor point, that I could use the pen tool to sort of trace each one of these areas out. I can use the same technique then to apply color to certain parts of a boot by pen tool tracing something out, like for example the sole. So often as I was working with this boot design, the sole was sort of lost, and so I pen tool traced the sole out, gave it a sort of a mid-tone gray color. That way I could sort of stick it back in, and each one of these sort of works like a layer. Now the last thing I'll quickly kind of refresh your memory on is the threshold tracing. if you need to pick up a little bit more detail, and you're not totally thrilled with the sort of flatness of a pen tool traced out design, and your object has a bit of grunge, a little bit of texture to it, well, don't forget that we can actually produce basic image tracing. An image trace should get you a fairly good silhouette of your object, especially if your photograph was taken against a nice clean white background. The image trace may run a little slowly on your computer, especially if these are large photographs, but as a little refresher, go to Window, Image Trace, and within Image Trace, as long as you have Preview turned on, you should be able to see sort of live tracing of your object. And depending on the results that you're looking for, you can increase or decrease the threshold. If I was just looking for a sort of silhouette of my boot, something right there looks pretty good. If I was trying to capture a bit more of the kind of grungy leather texture, I might go with a little bit lower one. And remember that each one of these traces out as a vector then. It's a usable vector space. Now I'm going to go back to the sort of silhouette threshold here, because there's some modifying that I may need to do to this. Because my boot had a bit of a shadow kind of falling out underneath it on this cinder block, I've got to modify my image tracing. To do that, I have to go to Object, Expand. Once it's expanded, I can actually edit individual anchor points. And in this case, I need to both delete the white background and kind of edit out some of this extra stuff down here on the bottom. I'll double click into the group here to delete away this white boundary. Or if you don't like double clicking into the group, just right click, ungroup. Generally, Image Trace puts things in at least 2 groups, so don't be surprised if you have to right click ungroup a few times. And now I'm just going to use my direct select tool to eliminate some of these anchor points, some of these just kind of cluster of anchor points that showed up down here. And I know that I've sort of cut a hole in my design. It's not going to work right. I've got an open filled spot here. But if I take my pen tool then, keyboard shortcut P, and continue or complete this gap by clicking on the one endpoint and joining it to another. I could even give it a little bend here to kind of create the illusion that that's still flowing like the sole was in the original image. And no one else will be the wiser that I had that kind of big ugly shadow sitting underneath. So now that I have this silhouette, I could do things like add textures directly to it. I could do a second image tracing and sort of stack the two on top of each other. In this case, I wanted to sort of have a little bit more of a leather-like feel to the vector tracing. So I did a background silhouette tracing, and then I put a second image tracing on top of it. And they both have very similar colors, just to kind of give it a little bit of a highlight, low light, or a highlight shadow feel. And when I put that to work in my boot designs, it just sort of became another layer stacked into the sort of puzzle piece. Without that layer, it still sort of feels okay, like you can kind of get the idea that it's a boot, but with that layer put in, it sort of like sells the idea a little bit more that this thing has that kind of leathery feel to it. Okay, the last thing I'll talk about in the demonstration is how to make use of some of those swatch patterns that we designed. So if I take that silhouette pattern that I used earlier, use this guy here, and I kind of use him as a base kind of fillable object, can't I use Window, Swatches, can't I use some of these swatches that we designed when I was working with my symmetrical patterns? Absolutely. And you could even go back into your designs now that you know how those patterns work, or check out the previous tutorial. The pattern work that we did was built out using the pattern maker tool, or the pattern options tool. And each time you kind of come up with a new one of those, it loads it into your swatches palette so that you can kind of toggle back and forth between those and fill entire shapes. In this case, I filled the entire boot. I overlaid the threshold on top and stuck the sole on so that it sort of still had a little bit of that boot feel. But this has got, a really different feel than that kind of grungier boot look. Any one of these approaches will work, guys. I'm excited to see sort of how you put this to task and what objects you choose and how your designs completely reinvent them. I'll catch up with you in the studio.